You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with economics correspondent at The Spectator, Kate Andrews, and political editor at the new Statesman, Stephen Bush. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The greatest, cyclist Jason Kenny wins his 7th gold medal on the final day of the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, making him Britain's best ever Olympian. That's on the Metro. The Sun also leads with the Games, celebrating Team GB's 65 medals. As do the Express, honour heroes who lifted nation. It says, picturing Welsh Olympic champion Lauren Price, who won gold in the boxing ring. The Telegraph, meanwhile, has the headline, "Too many teenagers are going to university," as the government encourages students to take up degree apprenticeships. Rishi Sunak remains focused on the economy in the wake of the pandemic. That's on the front of the Yorkshire Post after reports of rising tension between the Chancellor and Prime Minister. Almost out of time, the climate warning from scientists on the front of The Guardian on the eve of an IPCC report. The Daily Mail has a story on the pay of civil servants, alleging ministers want to pay those who continue to work from home less than colleagues who return to their desks. And joined tonight by Kate Andrews and Stephen Bush. Good evening to you both. Welcome. Let's start with the Metro and the Olympics, and pictured there, Stephen Kenny amongst others, having won his 7th gold. Sorry, Jason Kenny. Why did I say Stephen? Because you're Stephen Bush, that's what's thrown me. Jason Kenny having won his 7th gold medal. Absolutely triumphant there, Kate.
Yes, amazing. Although I would have loved to see Stephen compete as well. Maybe not. But it's been a huge success for Team GB, matching its wins in the 2012 Olympics, when, of course, that was hosted here in London. So to match that kind of success on the other side of the world in Tokyo is a huge win overall. The Metro is also flagging Lauren Price, who you mentioned before as well, who secured that 22nd gold medal for Team GB in those last days for boxing. So, 65 medals overall, ranking in the top 5. It's a big success story, and there were plenty of hurdles along the way. Of course, there always are, the kinds that, we can't even begin to imagine. We're talking about athletes training at the top levels, but this time around, they were also dealing with COVID. Not just the restrictions, not just the lack of fans, but many of them having to self-isolate or getting the virus themselves. So, huge round of applause for overcoming the extra hurdles that are already there, and a really, really good turnout for Team GB.
Yes, and it is a surprise success, isn't it, Stephen? And especially as we had all of those protests in Japan with local people not even wanting the Olympics to take place there and continuing to protest throughout.
Yeah, I mean, often you get a boost from hosting the Olympics, but the Japanese government, and particularly the Prime Minister, looks like they're going to get the reverse of a boost. The poll's very bad for him as a result of that. But in some ways, actually, our success now is the result of actions taken by a now, long-distant Prime Minister, John Major, big sports fan, who used national lottery funding after the disaster of, I think, the 1994 Olympics to really make Team GB competitive in the Olympics. That funding then boosted by Tony Blair after we'd won the Olympics after we'd won the bid to get the Olympics in 2012. But it really is, this really is, the medal team that John Major built, actually.
Let's move on away from the Olympics to the front page of The Telegraph. And this is a very interesting story. The headline there, "Too many teenagers going to university." Who exactly is saying this and why?
So with A-level results upon us, Sir Peter Lumpy, the founder and chairman of the Sutton Trust, and described here by The Telegraph as an influential figure in the field of social mobility, is saying that he's actually concerned by the numbers of applicants we're now seeing to university and the number of people going. It's thought that this number is going to continue to go up because of the system we've put in place for COVID, which is based on predicted grades. We're seeing an inflation in the number of students who are getting A's or A stars, which means that we should expect to see even more students going to university. Now, what Sir Lumpy JB is trying to push is the idea of apprenticeships, is that sometimes students will take on the burden of debt to go to university and then come out and realize that they didn't need that debt necessarily to pursue the careers they want to have. The problem is that the more that the government seems to interfere with apprenticeships, the worse the program seemed to go. When it brought in that apprenticeship levy in 2017, apprentices dropped by a quarter just 2 years after that levy was brought in. Of course, last summer we had Boris Johnson almost saying off the cuff that he thought every young person should have a guaranteed apprenticeship. But it does seem that the more the government interferes with such things, the more difficult they are to secure. So it's all about figuring out how we can actually enable business to offer these opportunities, and how we as a society need to be better at recognizing that the pursuit of university or an apprenticeship is equally as good, just fundamentally different based on what that student wants to do in the future with their career.
It is a lot about perception, though, isn't it, Stephen? Because you do get the feeling that apprenticeships are still viewed as the poor relative compared to a university place.
Yeah, it's ultimately about, that perception also. Then if you get an apprenticeship and, succeed in your first chosen career, and then, as people often do when they've succeeded in one career, decide they'd like to do something else, there's a perception that an apprenticeship is not a sort of universal sort of passport to various industries in the way that a broad degree often is, which is partly, of course, about things that the government can't control. Exactly as Kate says, it's about how employers react to this. But the point that Peter Lampel is raising particularly is about that debt, which obviously, of course, is not really borne by individual graduates, but by the Exchequer. It's really just a stealth income tax and a way to hide government borrowing. So if you have lots of people who are getting that degree but not getting the earnings boost, then essentially you've actually just got a large increase in government debt. Now, some people say you don't need to worry about that, but it is, if you are the kind of person who thinks then we should be concerned about the amount of government debt, it is a big problem that so many people and so many graduates are now becoming so indebted because it does all get passed on to the taxpayer in the end.
Kate, let's have a look at the Yorkshire Post next, and this story suggesting that Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson are at odds in terms of the approach towards the economy. They're suggesting that there was a story about Boris Johnson suggesting that he might demote Rishi Sunak because they are at odds. What more does this article tell us?
Well, speaking of tax and debt and the state of the public finances, the problems that the UK is going to have with these decisions down the road seem to be moving from the policy to the personal. And over the past week, we've seen quite a few briefings about inflated tensions between the Prime Minister and his Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. And as you mentioned, over the weekend, the revelation that he suggested that he could be demoted. Now, Number 10 and others are suggesting to some extent that this might be overstated, and yet they're not denying that it was said. I think there are a few things going on here. First of all, let's be honest, it's August. A small flare-up, a bit of tension between Number 10 and Number 11 might not be getting this much attention if we had bigger politics going on, but there's no doubt that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor for a long time now, since the beginning, since Rishi Sunak came on, have had different perspectives on the state of the UK's finances. Boris Johnson is more comfortable with debt. He's more comfortable with spending. He actually rejects the notion of austerity. He says he thinks it was a mistake. Well, Rishi Sunak's not embracing the language of austerity. He's much more concerned about the state of the finances. He wants to get the deficit under control. And he's going to be not excited to, but probably more serious about tackling some of the spending that's been going on, especially emergency spending, to get these things under control. So I think that policy tension is emerging in the personalities right now, but again, perhaps slightly inflated given the fact that the news is rather quieter when it comes to Whitehall in August.
Stephen, are you surprised by this? I mean, after all, it is the Chancellor's job to secure financial recovery. That's what he's supposed to do.
No, it's an open secret that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are not really aligned on economic vision. Some would say because the Chancellor has one and the Prime Minister doesn't really. But of course, the particular issue is that Rishi Sunak is deeply concerned that this extraordinary debt that we've accrued in this time is something he needs to worry about. Now, some in the Conservative Party say, just treat it like war debt, don't worry about it, and that gives you a lot more fiscal manoeuvrability. But because he does have that particular view, and the Prime Minister likes to spend freely, it's not, I think, just going to be a summer story. This is going to get a lot worse when we come back in the September, and there is a big, very going to be a big row about the content of that very austere budget.
To the Daily Mail, very quickly, Kate, and this story about civil servants who refuse to return to the office should take a pay cut because they're not carrying out the same role as their colleagues who are actually at their desks.
Well, there's one line that's going to jump out, I'm sure, tomorrow as everybody's discussing the front pages about how a minister has suggested that it's difficult to know whether or not someone at home was working or watching television. If we look at the difference between the spring lockdown in March last year and the winter lockdown this year, whilst the economy took a dip both times, it plunged last year, and actually it only fell a few percentage points in January this year. And one of the big reasons is that the business community built up a lockdown resilience. People adapted. They learned how to handle lockdown. It was still very economically painful, don't get me wrong, but the reality is that we know that most workers sitting at home were working very hard. I think it's a little bit strange to single out civil servants here. I think the crux of the story does have some truth to it, which is that when you are negotiating your pay, you will be taking into account the cost of commuting, the cost of often working in a city and having to leave your home, and all the costs that go along with that. That might be travel, that might be food, it could be a whole host of things. And the idea that actually if people do start to work from home on a permanent basis, that may well affect salaries. That's a consequence of working from home that a lot of people haven't wanted to speak about yet. But I think the accusation that people haven't been working, or that this is specific to government and not also the private sector, is a bit of an odd angle. But we should be honest about the trade-offs of working from home. And the truth is that when people go around to renegotiate their salary, to ask for a pay raise, their commuting costs may well be a factor in these decisions.
But the reality is many people say they actually work a lot harder and many more hours working from home. This comes ahead of the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report due out, and really saying that we are out of time. A very stark warning from scientists there, Kate.
Yeah, so this UN panel of experts has come together to release quite a major report. And it's ahead of UN talks that will be taking place in a few months' time. But of course, it's ahead of COP26 as well, which will be taking place here in the UK in November, the centerpiece really of the government's green agenda. And it's going to focus in on the major changes that the report thinks to be made in this decade. But it's also going to be focusing on the Paris Climate Agreement and whether or not countries are actually on their path to limiting heating to 1.5 C above pre-industrial levels. Let's be honest here, most countries have dropped the ball on this. There's been a really bad effort, to say the least, of shipping carbon emissions overseas, especially from developed countries to less developed countries, trying to take credit for things that they're actually just shipping away. So I think there's a really big question mark over not only UN talks, but also what happens at COP26. Is it going to be more rhetoric, or are they actually going to start to come up with solutions? And are they going to be honest with the public about those solutions? Because they are going to cost money. They are going to require some levels of sacrifice. And yet the narrative at the moment is that we can basically have our cake and eat it. This report, I suspect, it's out today, or it's out on Monday, and the reports to come will probably say actually tough decisions are going to have to be made soon.
Yes, and the scientists are saying that the fires, floods and extreme weather conditions that we've seen are just a foretaste of what to expect if global heating takes hold. And we've seen, we've been reporting from Greece tonight, the fires there. We've also seen the situation in California. Our correspondent there just saying that it looks like a war zone because of the fires taking place there. It is here, isn't it? Climate change isn't coming down the tracks. It has arrived, Stephen.
It has, and indeed in a much smaller scale. It's, the floods we've had in London this weekend and the floods we've had twice in London over the course of this summer. Kate's exactly right about, the failure of governments across the world and the big task we now have, both governments and all of us have, if we are to, avert the catastrophe that is, not distant, but arriving, as we speak.
very quickly, we've got time to have a look at the Financial Times, and this is a story about the Taliban, one that we've been covering ourselves with the interpreters that have been seeking sanctuary. They've been highlighted by the Taliban as traitors and find it impossible to stay in their country. And the story continues. The Financial Times taking it up there, Kate.
Yeah, horrifying violent scenes from this weekend as the Taliban make further gains. And this comes as the US is drawing down troops and preparing to leave basically completely by the end of the month, bringing to an end a 20-year war that the US has been waging arguably very unsuccessfully on many fronts. But it's a very difficult scenario. The pressure is on in America. It is across the political spectrum, frankly, Republicans and Democrats alike, to wind down and to bring troops home. And yet we can see already that the Taliban is taking advantage of the situation, and there's huge worry that a full-out civil war could break out if the US leaves.
They are gaining incredible ground, aren't they, in Afghanistan as we speak. Kate and Stephen, for the moment.